We're joined now by Kevin Hassett. He's chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisor. Welcome, Mr. Hassett. It's good to have you. I should say,
thanks.
Dr.
It's great
Hassett.
to be here.
Okay.
Oh, no. Kevin works.
Okay, Kevin. Great. Thank you. So I want to start out with where the president starts out in all these discussions. That is growth. This is all about growth. That's what we hear from Republicans all the time. By the way, Democrats as well. It's about growth. And let me pick on one of your colleagues up there, Gary Cohn. Gary Cohn was in New York. He went to a Wall Street Journal council of CEOs. And he asked a room full of CEOs, if you get a big tax cut, how many of you would invest it in plant and equipment? And he got virtually no response. And he said, why aren't you raising your hands? Why are you confident that, in fact, if there is this substantial corporate tax cut, it will go into investment in plant and equipment?
Well, actually, so fact check, that was in Washington, not New York, because I spoke at the same conference. And I asked a similar question, and I got more hands. So maybe that my question was better posed. I don't know. But the fact is that there's a big empirical literature that shows that when countries around the world have pursued tax bills like the one that we're watching the vote count on right now, that they've seen surges in capital spending and surges in economic growth. At the CEA, we put out a report a couple weeks ago where we reviewed that whole literature and said that we could expect to have 3 to 5% higher GDP 10 years from now because of all of the capital spending that would happen just from the corporate tax side of this bill. And so Gary was exactly right to ask the question, and maybe if people thought more about it, they would have all stuck their hands up, because the evidence is that they're going to go out there and they're going to act on this.
I think you're referring to those countries as Eastern Europe. Is it fair to make the comparison with the U.S., and don't you need to look back at U.S. history for that?
No, in fact, there's a massive amount of econometric work on U.S. history. I've written papers myself. There's a paper with Glenn Hubbard and the Brookings papers and so on, where we looked at the '86 Tax Act and the user costs of capital changes and how it affected investment. And so there's a massive amount of literature within the U.S., across U.S. states, across countries and so on, that shows that lower corporate taxes lead to surges in investment, and those surges in investment increase productivity and wages.
No question, Kevin, that investment in plant and equipment and more productivity would be great for the country, and we would really promote growth. Is this the most efficient way to do it? Because there are a number of economists I've read as well who say there is something called leakage. Some of the money will go into investment, a fair amount of it will go into dividends and stock buybacks, and that will go ultimately to the owners of the company, as it should, but those are the people who already have assets that are appreciating quite nicely. Thank you, ma'am.
Well, so what's going to happen is that the statutory corporate tax rate will benefit new capital and old a little bit, and the expensing will only benefit new capital. And so, on balance, it's a new capital-focused bill. On the individual side, there's a big tax cut for small business, which is where a lot of the entrepreneurship in society begins. And so I think that on net, it's the new capital, the new investment that's most stimulated by this bill. But it is true that if you're some firm that's existed forever and makes a little bit of money every year, then you'll benefit some from the lower statutory rate. And that's the leakage that you're talking about.
I want to talk about the monetary environment that we're at. In the first 3 years of the Reagan and Bush tax cuts, the Fed funds rate fell by 960 and 500 basis points. I'm reading some literature from economists saying that because the Fed funds rate right now is rising, that would be counterproductive to the tax cuts. Will there need to be some adjustments there?
I 100% respect the independence of the Fed, and I would never give them advice about what they should do with interest rates. That's not the role of the CEA. I can say that we have modeled the macroeconomic effects, as I mentioned, of this tax bill. And when you look at the supply side effects of this surging investment and so on, that doesn't create an interest rate path in the models that we look at that's inconsistent with the guidance that we get from the CBO's interest rate forecast or from the dots at the Fed.
So, Kevin, I want to talk about distribution for a second, and I don't actually want to go to rich versus poor. I'm going to go to a different place, and that is corporate versus individual. As I've seen the analysis, basically, roughly, there's the same number of nominal dollars in sort of tax breaks that go to the corporations and individuals. But as you know, the corporations pay a much, much smaller portion of total cash. So effectively, it's really distributing a lot more of the tax break to corporations. Is that the best way to do this? If you're a company, don't you mainly want your demand up? You want money in the pocket of the consumer to buy your product?
No, I think that the biggest tax problem that the U.S. has right now is that people want to locate their manufacturing activities and their other, service providing activities offshore, increasing demand for workers over there rather than, demand for workers over here. And they do that because they want to locate the profits in a low tax environment. And if we get a statutory corporate tax rate that's 20%, we get this corporate tax reform, then what's going to happen is they're going to start demanding workers here rather than over there, and that'll drive up wages here. The Joint Tax Committee put out a static score of what happens if we cut the corporate rate, which is not the end of the story. It's a very accurate static score. They're a great professional staff. But in the end, what's going to happen is that people are going to invest more here. They're going to pay people salaries here, and that's going to create a lot of dynamic revenue that's not included in that score. And so I don't accept the idea that half the cost of this is on the corporate side, because don't forget that the whole problem is that we have the highest statutory rate on earth, and we're collecting barely any revenue at all because they're moving the taxes and the income offshore. And so that's the thing that's addressed by this bill. And so the idea that it's going to hemorrhage revenue to cut the corporate rate is just inconsistent with the patterns we see in the data.
You've also defended repealing the state and local tax deductions because in the entirety of President Trump's tax plan, the middle class would benefit. When you take a look at the House and Senate bills, how close are they to what President Trump is envisioning?
President Trump has said over and over again that he's got three main objectives. That's a middle-class tax cut, simplification, and a corporate rate at 20%. And then he wants the House and the Senate to duke it out, to take their own preferences about equity and efficiency into the room and then figure out, what bill can deliver on those three main objectives and pass and become law. And that's where the president is on this. And getting in front of disputes between the two is not something that the White House is interested in right now. What we want is a bill that achieves the president's objectives, and it looks like they were going to take a big step in that direction today.
So, Kevin, finally and briefly, is that econometric analysis you referred to, is that available to the public? Is that something I can go look at?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Where
it's
is
in peer-reviewed journals. But the CEA has a website which you can find out if you just type Council of Economic Advisors website, where we put up a study just recently that reviewed more than 100 papers on this topic.
It's the next thing on my list. Thank you so much.
All right, great.
Kevin Hassett, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks,
He's the chairman
guys, for
of
having
the
me.
White House Council of Economic Advisors.